Chapter 14, we're going to talk about nervous tissue. And so we'll start out talking about the organization of your nervous system, some of the different cells you find in nervous tissue. We'll talk about this process known as myelination, where nerve cells have a wrapping that makes them conduct messages faster. We'll talk about how nerve cells can regenerate their pieces. We'll talk about the structure of a nerve, right? So not a nerve cell, but the entire nerve, and different types of synapses or points of communication between nerve cells. And then we'll also talk about different types of neuronal pools and something else called the action potential, which we'll wrap up with. Now, there's different ways we can divide the nervous system. We can talk about it either structurally or functionally. Structurally, there's just two main divisions of the nervous system. We got a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. But they're all made of nervous tissue, which is what we're going to talk about today. The central nervous system is only your brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. So all the nerves you might find in a limb or abdominal area or so elsewhere in your body that's attached to your brain and spinal cord, but aren't the brain and spinal cord directly, that's the peripheral nervous system. Otherwise, if it's brain and spinal cord, that's the central nervous system. That's the structural definition of the nervous system. And we can divide it further from there, as we will in like next week and the week after. Functionally, we can divide the nervous system into two divisions. We got afferent and efferent. Afferent is sensory, means it brings information towards your nervous system. So it's sensations bringing information towards your nervous system. And then efferent is information away from your nervous system, and that's motor. So efferent is motor output towards like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle. But together, we just talk about the one nervous system, right? Like, although there's structural and functional definitions of these things, together, it's one big nervous system that's all interconnected with, hundreds of billions of neurons. Now, the central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system are your nerves, like cranial nerves and spinal nerves, other peripheral nerves. And these are just things that are connected to your brain and spinal cord. Now, if it's a cranial nerve, these are the nerves that come off of your brain. They're attached to your brain, but they're not technically part of your brain, okay? So these nerves are just basically little fine extensions off of the brain. We call those cranial nerves. Otherwise, if they come off the spinal cord, we call those spinal nerves. And if it's the brain and spinal cord, that's your central nervous system. Otherwise, the peripheral nervous system is everything else that's made of nervous tissue. That's not your brain or spinal cord. Now, what we see on this slide here, you guys, is just a nervous system in reference to the anatomical position. So you see our brain, which is found in the cranial cavity, and our spinal cord, which is found in the vertebral cavity. Those together form your central nervous system, which is in the dorsal body cavity. And then all this yellow material that's attached to it, all of those are nerves that are involved with carrying either motor or sensory information. If it's motor information, we call that efferent, because it's going away from your central nervous system out towards muscle. And if it's sensory information, we call that afferent, because it's actually bringing information towards your central nervous system, where your central nervous system can kind of help process that information. Now, in terms of what the nervous system does for us, we know that it's like the master control center of our body, right? Like it does a lot for us. It helps control homeostasis, and it does this by like directing the activities of most other organ systems, right? So the activities of your digestive system are directed by your nervous system, and the activities of your muscular system are also directed by your nervous system. So how does this work? Well, many of these work in a feedback process where we actually have three main mechanisms here. We have receptors that pick up information. We have our brain and spinal cord that processes that information. Then we have nerves that carry information back out to an organ. And I'll give you guys an example of one. Let's say with blood pressure, you want to measure your blood pressure. That way you can kind of maintain it, right? Well, we have receptors for blood pressure in like our aorta and carotid arteries. And these can sense pressure, and if pressure is too high, that information can be picked up by receptors. It's sent to your brain, where your brain decides what to do with that information. That's the processing and evaluating of the information. Then your brain tells the appropriate effector what to do. And the effector is actually going to be the thing that helps to carry out the response, or lower blood pressure in this example, right? So that the effector could be like your brain telling your heart to beat more slowly or less strongly, which would help to reduce your blood pressure. And so these effectors are the things that carry out the response. And so this is actually one of the ways that our brain or nervous system together help maintain homeostasis. So we got to pick up information about our internal state. You know, whether it's body temperature, blood pressure, pH. That information is picked up by receptors. Good. Then the receptors send that information to the brain, which processes and evaluates that information. Good. And then the brain tells the appropriate effector what to do. Let's say if you're too hot, like your body temperature is too warm. Well, that information is processed by your brain, and your brain tells the appropriate effector what to do. So, an example of if you're too warm, what will be our effector organ for that? Skin, but specifically the sweat glands in skin, right? Yeah. So then our brain can tell our sweat glands to turn on and start sweating, which can cool us off. So that's this process here. And it turns out this type of feedback is really common throughout our body. So you think about like respiratory rate, same process. We have receptors for pH in our blood, and if our blood gets too acidic, then we start breathing more heavily. And that's mediated through the same sort of system. So let's actually use that example. Why not? So we'll say that we have receptors for pH that pick up information about blood acidity. If your blood's too acidic, that information is then sent to your brain, where your brain can process and evaluate the information, then tell the appropriate effector to what to do in order to reverse that condition, right? So if your blood's too acidic, then you can just breathe more heavily. You can expel that acid by exhaling it, and then your blood becomes less acidic or more basic. That can help bring you back to homeostasis. So that's one of the functions of our nervous system. Now, this is under more like unconscious control, though. You don't have to think about this occurring. Like a lot of these processes just happen, and we kind of take it for granted. Like we don't have to think about our blood pressure. It's just maintained on our own. We have to think about our respiratory rate. It's also just maintained on its own. And it's maintained through this process where we have receptors that pick up the information, the brain that evaluates that information, and then that brain tells the appropriate effector what to do. You might wonder, well, how does a brain tell something what to do? Well, the brain is connected to your peripheral nervous system, which are nerves, and those nerves can connect to lots of organs. So let's say in the example of with sweating, you know, your brain has nerves that come off, and then those can go to the sweat glands of your skin, and that can help initiate a sweating response to cool you down. Now, we can divide the nervous system functionally into two categories. We got sensory and motor divisions. The sensory part of your nervous system is just what picks up information, either information inside your body or outside of your body. That's the sensory division. And then the motor division of your nervous system controls smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle. Some of these are unconscious, some of these are conscious. So we'll talk about the difference between these. So what this flow chart here is showing you guys is basically just the functional organization of the nervous system. Not structural, but functional. Remember, structural was central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Functionally, we can divide it into sensory and motor divisions. So over here we have the sensory nervous system, which would contain receptors. We have lots of different types of receptors throughout our body that pick up information and different types of information. So we can have receptors for chemicals, like for taste and smell, or pH. We can have receptors for stretch, like that way we know that our bladder is stretched and we have to urinate, or that our stomach's full, we should stop eating. We have receptors for things like temperature or pain, and that information is picked up by these sensory neurons, which are part of the sensory nervous system, also called the afferent division. Afferent means sensory. Okay. Now, we have two types of sensory divisions. We have somatic sensory and visceral sensory. Visceral, remember, viscera means guts. So the visceral sensory nervous system is actually what picks up information from your internal organs, like your guts. So if you're feeling like pain from your internal organs, that's your visceral sensory system. Okay. The somatic sensory, soma means body, but typically, when we talk about somatic nervous system, we think of skeletal tissues and skin. So think of like bones, tendons, ligaments, joints, fascia, and skin. All of that is part of your somatic sensory system. And so this is going to pick up information, right? So you might wonder, well, what are we getting from our skin? Like, what type of information can our skin pick up? Yeah, touch, pain, pressure. Yeah, vibration, good. Temperature, exactly. And there's different varieties of those things, like different frequencies of vibration, different degrees of pressure. So our skin can receive all that information. Then it sends that information to the brain, where the brain can process and evaluate that information. Okay, so that's part of your somatic sensory system. You might wonder, well, what do skeletal muscles pick up? Well, they can actually pick up stretch. Like we can feel how much our skeletal muscles are stretched. Or what do our joints pick up? Well, we know the position of our joints. Like if you closed your eyes and just started moving your body around, right? Or had someone else move your body. Like let's say if you close your eyes and all of a sudden someone moved your arms out like this. Well, you know your arms are sticking out because you can feel them sticking out. You don't see them. You just rely on the information that's being picked up by receptors in your joints to know that, hey, now my arms are like this. Or, hey, now my arms are like this. Or like this. We can just start doing the YMCA, right? That's the somatic sensory system. Now, the motor nervous system is what controls smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. And we can divide this into two main divisions. We get the somatic motor and autonomic motor. Okay? The autonomic motor system we also call the automatic nervous system, and it's involuntary. You got it. So it controls smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands. Okay? So where do you find smooth muscle in the body? Organs, right? Hollow organs, right? In the walls of hollow organs. Good. And then what about cardiac muscle? Only your heart, exactly. And glands are all over, right? You got exocrine glands, which secrete some sort of substance like sweat or oil. You got endocrine glands, which secrete hormones. Well, the autonomic nervous system is what connects to these things, but it's automatic or involuntary. So what this means is that although it's part controlling muscle and glands, these are under involuntary control. Like you don't consciously control sweat secretions, or you don't consciously control GI motility, like how much your GI muscles churning or helping to move food along, right? So what we do control, though, is the somatic motor system. This is part of your voluntary motor system, and this is actually going to be controlling skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is what we've started to talk about in lab. Like all the muscles of the face we talked about, that's all skeletal muscle. That's under voluntary control. I like that. And did you do that intentionally? Yeah.
What was I doing?
Oh, never mind. So, I said we were talking about the muscles of the face. I said that's all under skeletal muscle under voluntary control. And right when I said that, you twitched your cheek. And I was like, nice. I like that. That was impressive, right? It was under voluntary control. Well, apparently not.
I like inside all the time.
But this is actually skeletal muscle, so it's voluntary. So what division picks up information from your guts? Visceral sensory. What division carries information to smooth muscle and cardiac muscle? Autonomic motor. Good. What division carries information from joints and skin? Somatic sensory. Good. And what controls skeletal muscle? Somatic motor. Good. So you want to know these divisions, you guys. And it makes sense because we have a whole chapter on the autonomic system, autonomic motor. We have a whole chapter on somatic motor, which we talked about last time. That was skeletal muscle. So everything we talked about last week was somatic motor system.
Can we say one more time the differentiation between motor and sensory? Since sensory is like what you feel.
Well, sensory
is like receptors. So
receptors.
That's information coming in.
Yeah.
And motor is information coming from the brain.
Out. Yeah. Sensory in, motor out. Exactly. Another word for that is sensory afferent.
Right.
Towards the nervous system. Motor efferent away from the nervous system.
Okay,
And all sensory's got to be in. That's how it's sensations, right?
Right.
Yeah, because it's coming from your peripheral parts of your body.
It makes sense if you think about it logically.
Yeah, and then it goes, and that information is sent to your brain where you can process it, and you can become conscious of these sensations. Or motor is all away from your nervous system, so it makes sense that it's away or out, which is efferent. Good. Now, we talked about how the sensory nervous system has somatic and visceral sensations, and so the somatic sensory would be things like touch, pain, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. Proprios means self, so proprioception means the sensation of your own body, but mostly with respect to joint position. So knowing what your body's position is currently, just feeling your joint stretch and that kind of stuff. You know, if you close your eyes, you know where your body's at, right? It's not like you close your eyes and go, oh, where'd I go? Right? You close your eyes and you still can feel your own body. Well, how do you know? You can't see yourself. Like, how do I know my arm's sticking out this way? Or how do I know that my thumb's sticking up like this? Well, I don't have to see it. I can feel it. I can feel it because I'm using my somatic sensory division of my nervous system. That's actually kind of cool. I think we take this kind of thing for granted. Imagine if this were damaged and you couldn't feel your own body. Imagine how frustrating that would be. Even walking, like just having to look at your own legs just to see where your legs are. And having to really think about where to put your feet because you can't even feel your own legs. And that can happen. And we'll talk about forms of spinal cord injury where you lose somatic sensory portions of your nervous system. Now, visceral sensory is information from viscera or guts. You might wonder, well, what information do you need to get from this? Well, you might want to get information about stretch or nutrients you have in a particular area or things like blood pressure or heart rate. That comes from your viscera or your internal organs. And this is typically unconscious. You know, for the most part, we're not conscious of our own blood pressure. Like, we don't know what that is, right? Nor are we conscious of our pH. But this is visceral sensation, so it's actually more of an unconscious mechanism. Now, there are some visceral sensations that we're conscious of, like if you have pain in an internal organ, you typically will feel that pain, right? Now, that is visceral sensation, but most visceral sensations are under unconscious control. And luckily, we don't have to think about them. Imagine how frustrating in life would be if you always had to worry and be conscious of your own blood pressure, your own respiratory rate, how fast your GI muscles moving. You'd be so preoccupied. Yeah, you're right. You could do anything. You'd be so preoccupied just trying to get all of this to work that you couldn't do anything else. You just would sit there and be like, right? Like making sure you're breathing correctly and that your blood pressure is stable, right? So that's nice. That's under unconscious control. I appreciate that. So the motor division of your nervous system, we have somatic motor and autonomic motor. Somatic motor is what controls basically skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is basically, the striated muscle that's unbranched, and you have nice long cylindrical fibers that are under conscious control. We call them skeletal muscles because they're typically attached to bones or your skeletal system. However, skeletal muscle can be attached to things like skin or other muscle or even fascia. And this is under conscious control. So if you're consciously controlling a muscle using your somatic motor system. So for instance, like if I ask you all to like touch your nose, then you're using somatic motor system to tell skeletal muscles to touch your nose. But how's it different from autonomic motor? Well, autonomic motor system here is information that's being sent to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and some glands. So you might wonder, well, why smooth muscle? Well, you find smooth muscle in the walls of hollow organs like your digestive tract, your respiratory tract, your genitourinary tracts, blood vessels. All that has smooth muscles in the wall of that organ. And luckily, we don't have to think about controlling those things. Like, we don't have to think about controlling our vessel diameter all through our body and the millions of miles of blood vessels we have. We don't have to think about controlling GI gut muscle activity to move things like food or feces along. Right? That's under unconscious control, and it's controlled by your autonomic motor system. Now, that's good, but it's also kind of terrifying because this also means, you guys, there's large parts of us that we have absolutely no control over. Like, we almost inhabit this body that is self-controlling, and we happen to have like a sliver of consciousness that allows us to do other things other than worry about our own body that we're inhabiting. I know it gets really creepy and philosophical, but like luckily we don't have to think about our own bodies too much because then we can think about other things like learning about our bodies or
What are you gonna eat for dinner?
yeah, what are you gonna eat for dinner, that kind of stuff.
What are you gonna eat for dinner? I'm interested. Like, we really only control a very small.
I don't know.
Like,
Probably
consciously control a very small amount of our function.
Yeah, it is a very small amount. Exactly. It also controls cardiac muscle, which is your heart, and so that's going to help control things like heart rate, rhythm, and force of contraction, which is going to influence things like blood flow and blood pressure, and certain glands too, guys. So when you think of like digestive secretions or sweating or oil secretions or saliva or certain hormones, that's controlled by your autonomic motor system. And we got a whole chapter on this coming up. That's our last chapter in AMP1. We'll talk about the autonomic motor system in more detail because there are subdivisions of this, and it's actually a really neat system that maintains homeostasis, basically keeps us alive. So the cells of your nervous system, there's two main types. We got neurons and neuroglia. Okay, so neurons are the electrical communicating cells. We call them nerve cells, and these are really interesting cells that have long extensions that can spread out into space and then connect to other cells. When they connect, then they can actually communicate. Okay? And these neurons are excitable, which means that they can pick up information and then carry or transmit that information down their whole length of the cell to another cell. Now, our brain's got about 100 billion of these things. So an average human brain has 100 billion nerve cells or neurons. It turns out actually you're born with more, surprisingly. You're first born with more than 100 billion neurons. You actually have 3 times the number of neurons at birth. But during development, there's a process of what we call pruning, where these nerve cells are basically intentionally killed to make your brain more organized. Because when you're first born, it's so disorganized that you can't really function very well, right? In fact, this is one of the reasons why they believe that we don't really form memories until later on, right? Like, you're not born, like, remembering things. You know, if you think you remember something that when you were 1, you probably don't. It's probably a false memory. The threshold seems to be around 3 years of age. And that seems to relate to the fact that there's a process of pruning and development where we actually lose neurons. And instead of having this unruly soup of neurons, things start to get more organized, and you can start to form memories, which is actually pretty cool. But you got 100 billion of these things in your brain. Each one of these neurons forms an average of 1,000 connections. So 100 billion neurons are forming an average of 1,000 connections. If you do probabilities here, you guys, like you take the probability of the number of neural connections possible in your brain. It's 100 billion to the power of 1,000, which turns out to be a number that's more than the number of atoms in the known universe. And I don't mean like the number of connections total. I mean the number of total possible combinations of connections is more than the number of atoms in the known universe. So it's a really complex organ. But what's fascinating to me, you guys, when you look at nervous tissue, it looks like just a lump of like gray material, you know, a little bit like cheese actually. It's got kind of a cheese consistency to it. And we'll do some sheep brain dissection later. But it looks so not interesting when you first see it. Like, oh, what is this stuff? Just kind of crumbles apart, and it's really mushy. But within that, there's a universe of structure that's supposedly one of the most complex things in the known universe. It's actually pretty cool. But of course, a human would say that, because your brain would want you to believe that it's the most complex thing in the universe, right? We think we're the best, right? Humans think we're the best. Yeah.
What do you mean when you say a neuron makes thousands of connections?
That's a great question. And in fact, let me come back to that because we'll see a picture of it and it'll make more sense. Now, these neurons are so metabolically active that they need their own support team. In fact, your nervous tissue only accounts for several percent of your body weight, maybe 2% or so of your body's weight. But it uses over 20% of your body's energy. So it's extremely metabolically active tissue. And it's disproportionately active to the rest of your body. And because it's so active, it needs some support team here. We call it glial cells. Glia outnumber neurons 10 to 1. So you have 10 times more glia than neurons. But these glia are non-excitable cells that basically help support the activities of neurons. So we'll first talk about neurons, and I'll come back to your question. So neurons are the basic structural unit of your nervous system. They conduct nerve impulses from one part of your body to another. They have a very high metabolic rate, which means they use a lot of energy. In fact, like I said, you guys, we use 20% of our energy just to supply our brain. And our brain is very picky about what kind of energy it uses. It only runs on glucose or sugar. And if your blood sugar gets too low, then your brain doesn't have nutrients to run on, and your brain starts shutting down. This is why when people have hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, they start to lose consciousness, or they start to get hangry, right? Like that's how I get. I get a little hangry sometimes. Like if my blood sugar starts to get low, you guys, then my higher brain center starts shutting down, and I start to get a little bit more animalistic, right? Maybe a little bit less patient, a little bit more forthright, you might say. A little hangry. That's because neurons have a high metabolic rate. They use a lot of energy. You got to keep blood sugar high enough to feed your neurons. So it's kind of interesting. They also have extreme longevity. What's surprising, you guys, is you will die with the same neurons that you were born with. So when you're born, you have those neurons that you currently have, and you will die with those same neurons. And that's unlike most cells of your body. Most cells of your body will divide and regenerate. And so every several years, you actually have new cells. That's different for the nervous system. Your nervous system actually has extreme longevity, and for the most part, these cells don't divide. We say that they're amitotic. But that's not entirely true. There are some neurons that can divide and can replenish certain brain tissue with neurons. But for the most part, your nervous system has extreme longevity, right? Like, think about some of the oldest people that have ever lived, like 120 or more or less. They would have neurons that are that old. And what's pretty cool is you can carbon date these things. Now, most are non-mitotic, which means they don't divide, but some are. This is actually pretty neat. But the reason why the nervous system is so susceptible to age-related diseases is because these cells don't divide, they don't replenish. However you live your life up until when you become elderly can influence the structure and function of your nervous system later on, right? If you had a kind of an unhealthy lifestyle leading up to old age, then you could be at a higher risk for things like dementia and age-related cognitive decline, that kind of stuff. Now, neurons have three main parts. We got cell body, dendrites, and an axon. Now, this is what this picture is showing a typical neuron here. So over here's the cell body. Let's call the soma. Soma means body. And the cell body contains most of your organelles. So it's got your nucleus. It's got your Golgi body, your smooth and rough ER. It's got ribosomes and mitochondria. And that's contained in the cell body. Now, all of these processes that come off of the cell are called neurites. And neurites are just cell extensions. But there's two types of neurites. We got dendrites and axons. Dendro is the root for tree, right? Like dendrologists are people who study trees. So a dendrite here is the kind of tree branch looking structure. And you guys notice that it has all these little extensions that come off. All those are a potential connection site. So when we said that neurons form up to thousands of connections on average, it's because these dendrites are so highly branched that other neurons can connect with them. Now they typically connect from axon to dendrite. So although this is the dendrite over here, it's typically the case that an axon of a different neuron would actually connect at the dendrite here. Now we also think about the dendrites as being the input end of a neuron. So this is where information is being sent to the neuron. Okay? And then from there, we actually have an output side, the axon. The axon is a long, slender process that can extend out into space. Axons can be up to feet in length. Like when you think about controlling muscles of your feet, there are axons from your spinal cord that gotta go all the way down your back, down your leg, all the way to your foot. And on me, that could be like 3 feet long or more. So that means there's an axon, which is a piece of the neuron that is that long. Although some are short too. Obviously, you don't need to have long axons in parts of your brain where you just have short distance communication, right? Now these axons are sometimes myelinated. Myelination is basically a wrapping here, and you can see this kind of bluish material on the axon. This little thing called a myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath is a wrapping of membrane of a cell, and it functions as an insulator. Insulators are poor conductors, which means they don't conduct heat or electricity very well. Now, in this example, we're talking about electricity, though, or current. You don't want electrical currents in the axon conducting through and actually affecting nearby tissues, right? Just like an electrical wire. Like think about the wire that's attached to our projector here up on the ceiling. Luckily, there's an insulator around that wire because if any of us touch that wire, the electricity would be conducted into our bodies and we get shocked, right? Well, around our axons of our nerve cells or neurons, we also have an insulator. And that insulation is the myelin sheath. So the actual axon is the yellow part that's deep in here, but the bluish wrapping is the insulation, which we call myelin. Its function is to help increase the speed of information transmission. So that without a myelin sheath, information travels much more slowly. With a myelin sheath, with that insulation, information zooms really fast. In fact, some axons can transmit action potentials at like 360 feet per second. So extremely fast. Now, other axons can only transmit action potentials or electrical impulses at like a foot per second. So pretty slow. Think about it too, if you're 6 feet tall, it can take several seconds for information to get to your brain. And that happens sometimes, especially with certain types of pain. We'll come back to that. So what are these structures up here? Dendrites. Is that input or output? Input. Good. How about this one? Cell body contains most of your organelles. How about this long, slender process? Axon. Good. And it's wrapped with myelin sheath, which is a insulator, right? Notice how the axon can kind of branch out here into what we call teleodendria. Well, one axon can branch into lots of extensions that can connect to many cells. Now, what's neat here, you guys, is that dendrites and axons can regenerate because all of the organelles are found in the cell body. So as long as the cell body is intact, if you cut an axon or cut a dendrite, those things can regrow. They can grow back. But if the cell body gets damaged, then the whole cell is going to die, right? Because that's what's got the organelles and your nucleus. So we'll come back to that later with axon regeneration. So let's look like on this histology slide up here, you guys. You can see our cell body and our nucleus. We've got an axon that's extending out into space, and then we got all these little dendrites out here. Do you notice that there's all these little nuclei around the neuron? These nuclei are glial cells. And so the glial cells that support these neurons. So glia outnumber neurons 10 to 1, so they're way more abundant. Now, in our cell body, we got a nucleus and a nucleolus. We got lots of mitochondria to make ATP, as well as ribosomes and other organelles to support the structure and function of the cell. Now, dendrites are the short processes that come off the cell body, and they receive nerve impulses. That's what we call them the input end, because they receive information from other neurons or their own receptors. Now, axons are the output set of a neuron because they transmit information away from the cell towards other cells. And these transmit nerve impulses very quickly. In fact, it's only in axons you get action potentials. Going back to muscle, we talked about how you had an axon of a motor neuron that then had a little synaptic knob, right? Remember I drew a little electrical shock bolt thing on the axon? Well, that electrical bolt is an action potential which travels down axons, and those things can travel really quickly. Like some of these, at their fastest, can go 360 feet per second, which is pretty darn fast. Much faster than we need to be concerned by, right? Like, obviously, we're nowhere near the scale of 360 feet. And it can go that fast in a second. So it's basically instantaneous as far as we're concerned. Now, not all neurons, though, have axons. Some neurons are anaxonic, which means they lack an axon, and they're just involved in kind of regulation and processing. But the place where the axon meets the neuron cell body is called the axon hillock, also called the spike initiating zone. And so the axon hillock is where action potentials begin. So if we back up here, you guys, back to this neuron structure, we have our cell body, dendrites, and axon. Where do action potentials or electrical impulses occur? Only in the axon. You don't find them in the cell body or dendrites. Okay? But it's at the axon hillock here, or spike initiating zone. This is where action potentials begin. And they begin right here at the axon hillock. Once they start, they zoom right down that axon really fast. And they even make that noise. If you listen closely, you can hear it. I'm just kidding. Yes?
The dendrites are for input?
Yes.
How does it, without an action potential, what is the input form take?
Oh, good. That's a great question. If you don't have an action potential in dendrites, how does information even get down the cell to the axon? It's a different type of electrical stimulus, but it's not technically an action potential. It's what we call a graded potential, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. It's a great question. Now, neurons can have axon collaterals and teleodendria, which are basically just branches of the axons. And the very expanded tips of the axon are called the synaptic knobs, or terminal bouton. And these contain lots of neurotransmitter-containing vesicles, which get exocytosed onto their post-synaptic cell or target cell. So what this table shows you guys just in different terms before we move forward. And these terms just describe some of the words we use in neurology or neuroscience. And so we know that a neuron is the structural and functional unit of your nervous system. And it's the nerve cell that communicates information. How many of these do you have in your brain? Yeah, 100 billion on average. Could be more, could be less. But it's actually pretty fascinating. There's that many in your brain. It's a tremendous amount. But they're small. That's why they can fit inside your cranial cavity. We have cell body, which is just the main part of the neuron. We have this thing called the perikaryon, which is cytoplasm of the neuron. We have neurotubules and neurofilaments. Now these neurotubules and neurofilaments are the cytoskeleton of a neuron. It's important to talk about neurotubules and filaments because neuron cytoskeleton basically gives the cell its structure. What if you had a disorder of neuron cytoskeleton and these cell processes couldn't stick out anymore? Let's say that it's like you had a disorder of the cytoskeleton. Now instead these cell processes kind of shriveled up and were all coiled in weird directions. They couldn't connect to nearby cells. You wouldn't have proper communication, exactly. In fact, that's one of the signs you see in Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, which is a form of dementia, affects these neurofilaments and neurotubules, and these cells can't grow their extensions very well, which is what causes that age-related cognitive decline and memory decline you see. And it's due to a dissociation of the actual skeleton of the cell itself. So we'll come back to that in future classes, especially like pathophysiology. Now, neurofibrils are basically just little aggregates of their neurofilaments. So these three kind of go hand in hand. Then we have dendrites. Which part of the cell were a dendrite? Branches look like trees. Off the cell body. They are also the recepting end, right? Or input end. Good. So input end. And then the axon is a long, slender process that goes off the cell. Good. It's the output end. This is where action potentials occur. What's the place where action potentials start? Axon hillock. Good. And then our axons can have lots of branches like collaterals, teleodendria, and synaptic knobs, which is actually not a branch, but rather the expanded tip at the end of the axon, which contains lots of neurotransmitter vesicles. And those vesicles can get exocytosed onto the postsynaptic cell or the receiving cell.